Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. What a week it has been. This was the view from my office window at the start of it. It felt like I'd been transferred to the Alps. Daytime temperatures close to freezing point, overnight lows not far off -10. But then through the weekend, the cold air was swept away in spectacular style, and by Monday morning, temperatures were 12 Celsius above freezing point. Well, the question, I guess, therefore, is will the cold weather be returning as we head through the Christmas period and towards the new year? Before I take a look at what may happen, I'm going to put a big caveat in here and say that the details are even more uncertain than is usually the case. Computer models are showing a wide range of solutions, so it's going to be difficult to draw conclusions. I'll do what I can. Starting with the view across Europe and the North Atlantic, the animation runs from 18 GMT, Tuesday the 20th, based on data from the GFS model today. At the outset, it's a much more familiar picture than has been the case recently. Low pressure there, centred close to Iceland to the northwest. It's pushing an Atlantic airstream right across the country. The isobars quite closely packed together, meaning rather windy conditions. At this point, it's dry in central and eastern Britain, but there are some showers in the west, even a little bit of snow there over high ground in Scotland. And as I run this, the Atlantic remains in charge through the coming days. Strong winds at times, heavy outbreaks of rain pushing across all parts of the UK. But look to the north as we go through Christmas Eve. Cold air starts to sweep southwards, white shading appearing there, indicating snow. Even in parts of northern Wales, central northern England, there's a little bit of snow showing up there during the 24th as that area of rain moves eastwards across the southern part of the UK. Colder air on its northern edge bumps into it and rain starts falling increasingly as sleet or snow. But by this point, it's not far ahead. It's only a few days off. There's already quite a lot of uncertainty because different computer models are handling this differently. Just running this through to its conclusion, that cold air pushes southwards, then through Christmas Day, milder air returns northwards. It brings a possibility of some transient snow, a technical white Christmas. Through Boxing Day, the 27th and the 28th, low pressure in the Atlantic has really spun up, it's deepened, and it's driving the weather across the UK. The mild air returns northwards to all parts of the country and it stays unsettled. Looking at the air temperature sequence associated with that GFS run, at the outset, here's the area of low pressure, the light blues and light greens over the UK indicating not far from the norm. As I run this, milder air pushes across the south at times, but then here comes a cold march from the Arctic, sweeping down across the northern half of the UK through Christmas Eve. It does make some progress southwards for a short time, as I mentioned, but then through Christmas Day, the 26th, the 27th and the 28th, it's turning milder again as that low pressure really deepens to the west and winds go into a southwesterly direction. A lot happening there. And I just thought it would be quite interesting to compare the GFS model here, which the animation was based on, with the ECM deterministic and the Canadian deterministic there. Because, as I say, there are some key differences in how these develop. If I just run this sequence, we can see by Christmas Eve, colder air moving southwards on the GFS. ECM there has low pressure centred close to the UK, so the colder air is going to be a little bit delayed. The Canadian model at the bottom right, high pressure perhaps holding things milder in the south. So key differences for the big day itself. And just to run this through to its conclusion, there we go. There are some significant differences by Boxing Day in terms of how cold or mild it's going to be, what the risk of snow or rain is. Snow generally more likely in the north, but with the GFS bringing that milder air back from the southwest through Christmas Day, it's just possible that some places could be seeing some snow falling, not just in the north of the UK. A lot of uncertainty and key differences between those models. Now, coming back to the temperatures which we can expect if the GFS is correct, these are forecast maximums on Wednesday the 21st, 7s, 8s, 9s in southern and central Britain, colder as you head northwards, quite close to the seasonal average. Going forwards to Friday, at this point it's mild in the south, double figures, 10, 11, 12. The colder air there in central and northern parts of the UK. This is when rain was starting to increasingly turn to sleet or snow in the north. The Christmas Eve maximums, well, the cold air making good progress southward. So apart from the south coast here, where temperatures are still reaching double figures, it's generally colder everywhere, but particularly in the north, very cold across Scotland. Christmas Day itself, these are forecast minimums at 06 GMT. Not sure whether there's going to be a lot of snow around for Santa, as I said. That's all in the balance, but in the north in particular, it's very cold, temperatures well below freezing. Even in the south, only 2, 3 or 4 Celsius above it. So a seasonal start to Christmas Day, I think, if that's correct. But as I keep saying, a huge number of possible differences there in how the weather may pan out through the 25th. Just on the global scale, these differences are quite small, but the impact they have on the weather in the UK is very large. Going forwards to Tuesday the 27th, this is the GFS, remember it had the milder air returning northwards, so double figures in southern Britain, still colder in the north at this point, just a few Celsius above freezing point, but the milder air is making its way there as well. I've mentioned that the Atlantic's really going to be driving things, particularly through the early part of the week, but also possibly later on as that area of low pressure spins up to the west. That could well bring some very windy conditions at times. The chart here is not to be taken literally, it's just to illustrate how things could develop. It's actually midday on Boxing Day, showing forecast wind gusts, gales there in the north and western coastal counties. But do keep an eye on the short range forecasts because it could turn very windy at times, not just on Boxing Day. Even, as I say, through the first few days, there is that potential there. Rainfall. The charts here show aggregate totals for days 0 to 5. The one on the left generated from the ECM model, on the right from the GFS. Significant rain in all parts of the UK, perhaps with the exception of northeastern Scotland, which is going to be in that colder air mass for much of the period. But there are differences here between the ECM and the GFS. The distribution varies. In general terms, probably the west seeing higher totals. Moving forwards to the 0 to 10 days period, some very large amounts of rain being forecast by both of these models, particularly with the GFS on the right, the orange shading across much of Wales and England, central and northern England, indicating values of 100 millimetres or above through the 10-day period. ECM on the left, not quite as wet, highlighting a difference between these two models. But how do the deterministics in general stack up against each other towards the end of the first week? Here is the GFS, which the initial animation was based on low pressure in the Atlantic, a southwesterly flow moving up across the UK. It's worth noting though, high pressure over Greenland. And whilst that remains there, there is the potential, and that's all it is, for things to turn much colder in the UK, something which would need watching. At the same time, the Canadian model is different. It has low pressure over the UK, cold Arctic air there to the north, and high pressure nowhere near as strong over Greenland. The German icon, different once more. Cold Arctic air moving right down across the UK at this point, but pressure weaker to the northwest. It looks like the potential at least for a more Atlantic-driven pattern going forwards, but that would be second guessing where things may go. The European ECM at the same time, high pressure building from the southwest, ridging up towards Iceland there, and a cold plunge moving down from the north, albeit a transient one, because this high pressure would topple over the UK and eventually we would see winds coming back in from the southwest. A toppler scenario, as these sometimes get called, so a relatively short cold snap. Finally, the UK Met Office Global. Different once again, there's low pressure up to the north. It's a slack pressure gradient across the UK, so relatively cold air in the north, milder in the south. Quite difficult as well to second guess just how this would develop. So what do the MOGREPS G ensemble stamps show at the same point? So these are generated by the UK Met Office, and it's a very, very mixed picture. Very uncertain, as I've annotated on here. High pressure potentially having more influence in the south, so more unsettled in the north of the UK. But if you look at the individual stamps, it's quite difficult to see them on a small screen in particular. There are a range of solutions being shown here. Remember that each one of these stamps is one of the individual runs from the MOGREPS G ensemble. Well, putting all that together, the Christmas period and beyond, it's very, very difficult to draw any conclusions. In general terms, colder air is more likely to be affecting the northern half of the UK from Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, Boxing Day, and the 27th. But there is that possibility, at least, of it pushing southwards for a time, and that could just throw a cog into the spokes, possibly giving a technical white Christmas in some parts of southern Britain. Uncertain. With that said, how are things looking as we go into week 2? As ever, at this range, it's just about trends and probabilities. And on this particular update, forecast confidence is even lower than usual, as I've been saying. But here's the 16-day GEFS plot for London. Air mass temperatures on the top half, often slightly above the average. The purple line, the ensemble mean, stays above the 30-year norm, the thick black line. There is a big spread though, some significantly colder runs in the mix and a number of much milder ones too. Rainfall or snowfall across the bottom, spikes show up throughout the second week, so an ongoing risk of rain. The snow row values, which can take a maximum of 33, don't climb above 3. A very low chance of snow through the second week, at least according to this data. And I thought it would be worth just breaking it out in a little bit more detail. This is another graph plotting air mass temperatures from the same GEFS model run, but it's filtered to only show runs which are forecasting 850 HPA values to be at or below -5 Celsius at some point through the 16 days. And there are 21 out of 31 runs which have been shown on this particular plot going for that meter-mac criteria. If I change the criteria though to only show runs going for -10 Celsius or lower, we're now down to 3 out of 31. Also, it's worth highlighting that even the ones which do dip down to -10 only stay there for a short time. They quickly recover. -10 is often used as an indicator for a really sort of deep cold spell in the United Kingdom. And you'd be looking to see those -10 runs staying below that level for a number of days rather than just a very short period, maybe 6-12 hours on these runs. And as I say, it's only 3 out of 31 anyway, so about a tenth, about 10% of the total runs in the GEFS ensemble bring deep cold air down to southern Britain, and those only do it for a very short time. But the European ensemble, a little bit different. Again, this one shows air mass temperatures. It's for London. Now the ensemble mean in the early part of week 2 is several degrees below the thick black line, the 30-year norm. And quite a few of these runs are dipping significantly lower, indeed towards the -10 Celsius level, but once more only for a short period of time. It's unusual to see differences like this between the GEFS and ECM ensembles. although in recent days it has happened more frequently than is normal. I think it's really down to small changes making a huge difference. It's just really where that boundary between the cold and mild air masses sits. 100 miles north or south is nothing at all on the global scale, but I think it's having a big impact on what a lot of the individual runs in the ensembles are currently showing. To summarise, it would suggest that ECM is given a greater chance of colder air covering parts of southern Britain, at least for a time during the second week, than the GEFSs, so ECM going colder on the whole. The 2 metre temperature data table from the GEFS, so the milder of the two ensembles, suggests that on most days, because each column represents the forecast maximums from all the runs on the particular day, the light greens will be dominant. So those are runs going for between 6 and 10 Celsius. There is a reasonable amount of dark green here, up above 40% for a time. Those are runs going for between 1 and 5 Celsius, so cold. But the majority pointing towards average conditions on each of the individual days. I think, though, it would suggest a reasonable chance at least of some colder days being thrown into the mix, but average or maybe even a little bit above average overall. Going up to Manchester, looking at the GEFS, air mass temperatures here are close to the 30-year average. The purple line stays very near to the black line throughout the second week, so a little bit colder relative to the average looks more likely as we're heading northwards. Not particularly cold though, and the rain spikes across the bottom there continue to appear through the second week. Not a huge number of them later on, so I would expect some drier days at times. The snow row values are higher than they were on the London plot, particularly early on, reaching 9 there on the 27th, the 28th, and dipping down. A chance of some transient snow, I think, through the first few days, but that diminishes through the period. The 2 metre temperature data table for Manchester, similar to the London one, although the light green columns are a little bit smaller, the dark greens a little bigger, and also just a little bit of blue appearing there. The blue maximum temperatures are between -4 Celsius and 0 Celsius, the very, very cold scenario. So this reinforces the air temperature profile of indicating colder conditions relative to the average as we head northwards. And continuing the journey, going up to Glasgow, at this point, the ensemble mean is below the thick black line for much of the second week, although it climbs above it during the last few days. Colder than average, quite likely, especially through the first half of the second week. And the number of spikes there along the bottom is not that dissimilar to on the other plots, but the snow row values are somewhat higher. 17 at the very start of the second week, dipping to 11, and gradually diminishing later on, supporting the same pattern for Manchester and London, which is that the risk of snow probably decreases later on, although in London it was very, very low even at the start of week 2. The 2 metre temperature data table for Glasgow, more blues here, a significant amount of blue through the first few days of the second week, so the very cold runs. Later on, the amount of dark green is increasing, as is the amount of light green. Temperatures trending upwards, returning back towards the average later on. The GEFS 10-day mean surface level pressure plot, so Friday the 30th of December, quite difficult to read too much into this. Really very difficult to read much into it at all, but it looks like quite a slack pressure pattern over the North Atlantic, a range of possible scenarios being blended together here because it's calculated by averaging out all of the individual runs in the ensemble. Likewise, with the ECM, perhaps though suggesting high pressure will be having more influence over the southern half of the UK, a stronger signal than on the GEFS. Breaking out the individual runs to show them in the postage stamp format, really pick and mix. Again, these are for Friday the 30th. Each stamp showing the forecast output from one of the individual runs in the GEFS model. I've annotated this, but it is a little bit subjective. Approximately 25% of the runs have high pressure to the north of the UK, for example, over Greenland or Iceland, which would substantially increase the chances of it turning very cold in the UK. As I said though earlier, it is not a given if high pressure builds over Greenland. It's just increasing the risk. About 40% of these have high pressure close to the UK. If they are correct, it would lead to an increasing chance of nighttime frosts. Daytime temperatures could well be low. Much would depend on where the high pressure became centered. Just small adjustments to its positioning could result in very different weather conditions over the UK. But having said that, a large number of the individual runs are showing changeable weather, with low pressure having quite a lot of influence. Rainy or showery conditions, snow more likely in the north. Finally, the mean surface level pressure data table for York, just to see if this can help cast any more light on how things are going to shape up. The oranges are showing higher than average pressure. The yellows are a mix, but a lot of the runs in the yellow category are at least a little bit higher than the norm. The greens and the blues are runs going for lower pressure. The signal probably therefore is for pressure to be above the average for much of the second week, but maybe not strongly so. And again, it's really just worth highlighting that about 11 or 12 of the GEFS runs had high pressure building close to the UK. They were not the majority, but looking at the ensemble data set as a whole, the signal is for high pressure to be having more influence through the second week, possibly. So to summarize, it's a bit of a dog's breakfast this week, but week one, it starts changeable, heavy rain and strong winds move eastwards across the UK at times. Later on, it turns colder in the north, therefore the risk of snow increases, and the colder air could push southwards at least for a short time. It really does add a good deal of uncertainty into the details for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Week two, cold incursions are more likely in the north. There is an ongoing risk of rain with the possibility of snow in the north, but a weakish signal exists for high pressure to bring drier periods, and depending where it becomes positioned, it may well lead to a risk of frost becoming more widespread. A UK-wide cold spell is possible. It's not the favoured scenario, but as I noted, a number of the individual runs within the ensembles are showing high pressure close to Greenland. And if that is the case, the chance of cold weather in the UK becomes significantly greater. So, there we have it. A very, very uncertain medium range outlook. At times in the UK, when looking at the weather prospects perhaps more than 5 or 7 days ahead, the computer models suggest quite a strong signal, at least about the general direction of travel. In early December, the cold period was well signposted. At other times, such as at the moment, a range of outcomes are being suggested and there isn't really a firm favourite between them. That means it is a very, very low confidence forecast prediction on this update. It could go a number of ways through the second week. It feels as though the atmosphere, after being shaken up in early December, is trying to restore its equilibrium. The Atlantic trying to become ascendant once more, bringing milder and wetter conditions across the UK, northwestern Europe. But whether or not that will be the case, as it was, for example, in 2010, or it won't, which is what happened in 1978-79, is very much open to question, at least at the moment. Anyway, as ever, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please support the channel by hitting the like and subscribe buttons below. Thank you for watching now. Bye.